I'm Kara O'Donnell, and this is County Board Wrap-Up, our monthly look at the key decisions the Arlington County Board has made that affect you, your neighborhood, and our community. With us here today is County Board Chair Katie Crystal and Board Vice Chair Christian Dorsey. Thank you both for joining us today. Now, the board took a couple of big redevelopment projects at its November meeting, gave the county manager some guidance for the fiscal year 2020 budget, and we looked ahead to the 2019 Virginia General Assembly legislative session. So let's get right into it, and we'll start off with the Virginia Hospital Center expansion. Now, we talked about this last month, I believe, maybe 2 months ago. Yeah. And you decided at that time to kind of just take a step back and reevaluate a little, delay that decision. But we went forward at this meeting. What happened to help you come to a decision?
Absolutely. So the decision in September was a deferral with some very specific guidance to the hospital. We knew this was a community process that unfortunately had not yielded consensus. Not all of our community processes do. What the board felt was clear that the hospital was not meeting the basic threshold of good design that is respectful and integrated into the surrounding neighborhood. We didn't believe, however, that a few more months of community noodling was any more likely to lead to consensus on that. And so we came up with, I'd say, more prescriptive than usual guidance to the hospital about targets we wanted them to hit to attain a couple of core principles, breaking up what felt like a really massive block facing the neighborhood and introducing more light, air, and pedestrian connectivity through the site, thus making it better integrate with the neighborhood. So what they came back to us with were some new designs that sought to, at least in part, and that was the rub, address that relatively narrow guidance. And a narrow majority of the board did decide to move forward on the plan at this point.
So did this seem to address the community's concerns, some of the concerns that you heard from the neighborhood?
It did. It didn't get all the way there, as a few things do, and there are going to be some people who are definitely impacted more than others by the hospital's expansion, particularly with the location of traffic lights. And we think that we can mitigate some of those concerns as we get to those final levels of design. But ultimately, I think the narrow board majority did agree that it had very much met the spirit of what we had intended, if not the letter. And given all of the constraints that we were dealing with, it got as close as it possibly could to meeting our goals and objectives, and hopefully now we can move to a better place.
That's right.
And what does this expansion really mean for Arlington and its healthcare services?
Absolutely. So, some of those questions could be best answered by the hospital center itself, and they were in our, I think, 6.5-hour public hearing back in September. They had a great many employees making the case for why this expansion, which will take up about 5.5 acres additional to their campus, was so sorely needed. But at a high level, it is going to include an outpatient building that will allow them to move a number of functions to this new site, thus freeing up more acute care spaces in the primary hospital area, and meet the needs of parking for the whole site in this part, so that they can, again, free more area for hospital uses. And they hope introduce some predictability to the flow of where to park right now, which is, frankly, a current logjam, which can have spillover consequences for the neighborhood, and certainly is, the hospital was arguing anyway, at least, impacting patient care.
Now, I know as part of this, the county also acquired, the hospital actually acquired the Edison property. What is the county getting in return for that?
Money and property. Yeah. So two key things that are very much hot commodities in Arlington County. So, as part of this, we've opted to take the Carlin Springs property on which the hospital's urgent care center currently sits, and once we value this transaction, so what the Edison property is worth, we will subtract out what the Carlin Springs property is worth, and any balance will be either cash or other property that the hospital holds that Arlington may choose to take advantage of. So those details, we still have about 90 days before those get worked out, what the valuation and what the exact exchanges are, but we now know that we'll be parting with Edison and we'll be getting property in a part of the county that we need, and probably some cash.
Now, many in the community were hopeful that the hospital would contribute to some mental health care, crisis care for adolescents. What can you tell me about that program?
Absolutely. This has been a really important issue area that's really proceeded along the same track as the land use, or in parallel to, rather, the land use issues, which is improving mental health care for adults and children in our community. The hospital took a number of steps to improve its facilities for adults in mental health crisis, but it doesn't offer pediatric services. And so there were extensive conversations about if Virginia's Hospital Center could not offer these services on site for a variety of reasons, what could we expect of them as a partner in our community in meeting this critical need? Because we do know that children and young people are showing up at Virginia Hospital Center in acute crisis. So as a result of a really extensive set of negotiations and conversations led by our Community Services Board, which is a partnership both of professional staff and citizen leaders, many of whom have personal experience as parents of children or grown children with mental or behavioral health needs. As a result of their extended conversations, there was a new model created that Virginia Hospital Center will pay for. It funds a clinician to deliver acute services in terms of de-escalation, intensive wraparound placement services, and beyond for those young people who do show up in mental health crisis. That's sort of the nuts and bolts of it. To speak about it from a human face, we heard as board members, I know the hospital heard, and certainly our CSB heard from so many parents about how traumatic it is for a young person, a child especially, to be hospitalized, and to be hospitalized somewhere like VHC where they don't have the expertise on site. We'll be able now to bring them to our Human Services Center at Sequoia with a dedicated clinician who has a background in treating their unique needs and get them placed in a much more therapeutic setting and a much less traumatic one. I think it's a really good thing for our community.
Indeed.
Really valuable service to be offered.
Yeah.
All right, well, we will look forward to those changes, but we are going to take a short break now. And when we return, we'll talk about the board's guidance to the manager for his construction of the proposed fiscal year 2020 budget, as well as the board's approval of a new elementary school in Westover. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm here with Board Chair Katie Crystal and Vice Chair Christian Dorsey, who are giving us a little bit of a look at planning for the fiscal year 2020 budget, as well as a new elementary school at the Reed site in Westover. Now, with the planning for the fiscal year 2020 budget officially kind of got underway with this meeting, with the board's guidance to the manager, and what are really the key elements that we should look for?
Well, first, some context setting. We are looking at a challenging budget year where to continue services and programs that we had last year, we're looking at a deficit of $25 to $30 million. And that's due to the primary factor of our being in a period where growth is not keeping up with expenses. So we have had growth, which is a positive thing for any community, but it's been about half of what expense growth has been. And that expense growth has been within the range of what we would hope for, so we don't have any problems there, we just have not enough revenue growth. So with that, we've got a few options that we'd like the manager to sort of take into his budget laboratory and work on. What does it look like if we don't change any of the levers that we can change on the revenue side? So that's the tax rate. We don't change it at all. What do we have to cut, eliminate, and change in order to meet the balanced budget requirement? Secondarily, let's think about what are some of the key areas where we've had new mandates or new exogenous external forces thrust upon us that we weren't expecting. And those include some state unfunded mandates dealing with Medicaid, the expansion of Medicaid, an overall good thing, but it's shifting some costs to us. There are some issues related to Metro, again, a good thing, but more cost to us. And then we also have schools opening 3 new facilities and overall moving 5 new programs, and they still have enrollment growth. So let's figure out what those things, if we were to prioritize those, what would be the way that we could construct a balanced budget around it. And there were a couple of other scenarios that we tasked the manager with working up for us so that during our budget season, we can really have an earnest dialogue, not just among the board, but with the community about what we prioritize and what we're going to preserve to meet this fairly challenging budget scenario.
Now, we've been talking now for a few months of how this past year's budget was a challenging one, and that we're looking at this again this year. Let's kind of lay it out there what we mean by challenging? Are we looking at program cuts? Are we potentially looking at staff cuts? What are some of the things that are realistically on the table here?
You know, I think Christian alluded to this about sort of our changing dynamics, but the issue really is, for a long time, as we often talk about, there's been roughly a 50-50 split between residential and commercial taxpayers. The commercial side has included that office space, as we've talked about 1 in 5 square feet of which is vacant right now in the county. And so we haven't seen that revenue coming in or growing at relatively flat rates. What that basically forces is a question among residential taxpayers to say, this level of service that our business side has been subsidizing, do you want to keep that level of service and pay more for it, or would you like to decrease that level of service? That's the question on the table, and to answer your question, that's a challenging one. No one would like to pay more for the same or get less for the same. And so I think that's why as Christian alluded, we really tried to talk about tiers. That's a tough question to answer in the abstract. We're going to try to answer it in the specifics. What are the programs that would need to be cut, eliminated entirely, dramatically reduced back, and in order for us to not raise the tax rate? And is that acceptable to the community?
Now, we also talked a little bit about closeout funds from fiscal year 2018. There's some confusion out there as to kind of what closeout funds are and how that kind of works into the scheme of things. Let's talk a little bit about that. Explain that a little bit.
So once you balance all the books from your fiscal year, you add up any monies that you have left over, whether it be through savings when departments didn't spend as much as they were expecting, revenue came in a little bit higher than you were expecting, or as is our case, the combination of a lot of different factors. And those funds are then available for the board to decide how it wants to use them. You can think about unfunded priorities from the previous year that you wanted to do but that you didn't think you had the capacity to do. New emerging needs that really manifest in the current fiscal year, or as what we did with 75% of the closeout funds, say, you know what, let's apply it to next year. And particularly when you have a tough, challenging budget time, it's very responsible that you're not creating ways to spend a prior year's surplus, but instead using that as part of your strategy to actually make sure you can meet the needs that you know you're going to have coming up.
What kind of a dent does that really make?
Well, and this is a great question, because here's what those closeout monies are not. Ongoing money. And so it's very tempting to say, right, 16.5 million being carried over. Christian just said we had a budget gap of 25 million. All right, we're down to 9. The issue is, and we always use or I often use anyway, the analogy of you can't use your birthday check from your grandmother to pay your rent, right? That's not sound fiscal planning. That is a one-time source of revenue for an ongoing need. So there are always one-time needs in our budget that appear during the budget process, and I do think having $16.5 million realized in closeout money will help us think about those one-time needs. But it is not, unfortunately, going to solve for us the difficult conversations about the structural difference between the rate of growth in our programs and services and the much lower rate of growth in our revenue.
So it's where those ongoing expenses that we're encountering.
And especially because, a significant chunk of money that we've used from previous closeouts to fund is our investments in affordable housing, something that this board also through its guidance told the manager that we wanted to continue at the same levels as previous years. And without the closeout money going to support that function, it just means that's a function that now needs to be substantially looked at next year. So this is not $16.5 million of newfound money that's happy. We have many needs that are going to far outstrip our capacity.
Now, how can our residents really get involved in letting their voices be heard on this budget process?
Absolutely. Our budget process is very participatory. Sometimes it feels like the phase of participation stretches ever further. But they can find at budget.arlingtonva.us both the guidance that we just issued is already up online, along with some of the revenue forecasts if they'd like to immerse themselves, as we've been doing, in sort of the broader budget picture. Between now and February, when the manager is is developing his budget. It will be an opportunity for people, again, to familiarize themselves with the conditions. The manager will release his budget at our late February meeting, which will be the board's first look at it, the community's first look at it, and that kicks off a really intensive 2 or 3 months. There are budget work sessions that people can tune into, do a deep dive in the departments they care most about or departments they think should most be targeted for reduction, as the case may be. We have a number of engagement opportunities directly with the county board. Open Door Monday, we take comments on the budget. Historically, we've done as well a budget survey. We really aren't kidding when we say that we want to and deeply consider hearing from what Arlingtonians value, and that's especially true when there are not enough resources to cover all of our priorities.
All right, well, we'll see what our residents have to say as we move forward through the winter. But of course, a little bit of foreshadowing, Christian, that you gave on this was the talk of new schools, and the board did approve a plan for a new elementary school on the Reed site in Westover. Now, do you think this was a generally supported new site and community can
contrary
get
to
behind it?
VHC, this was one where there was actually
easy.
consensus. People came
really
together
nice to see.
fairly early about how this school should be sited and situated with the existing library at the Westover site, and I think they came up with a really tremendous design that, as importantly, is efficient and utilizes the principles that came from our community facility study several years ago, which looked at vertical construction instead of sprawling construction. So they've got a nice design. It's integrated through some tweaks. We were able to maximize the amenities that were there while keeping as much open space as possible, making it accessible to people with disabilities. I think they really did a nice job, and also, as importantly, there was some work on a process to make it as efficient or more efficient than some of our processes have been in the past. And we've also applied some new work from our permitting department working with schools to streamline the number of conditions that that school construction will be subject to, which will also hopefully make it be a lot easier to accomplish on time and, most importantly, on budget.
And what's really this going to mean for the community of Westover?
Well, it's interesting. 732 seats are coming to the school, but it's going to be a neighborhood school. So that location uniquely marries very nicely with a lot of students who are going to be able to walk to it. So in terms of the impacts that you typically feel with a big development project, this is really, I think, going to work well. You're not going to see a huge amount of increase in traffic. You're going to see a lot of kids walking to school with their parents, biking to school. It's going to be, I think, a stellar project for Westover.
And it's part of an existing area with community service or community facilities already. It's a civic presence between the Westover Library, formerly the children's school used to be located there, serving the pre-K kids of APS employees and kids with special needs. So I think actually the use won't feel that different than what the neighborhood is used to.
All right, well, we will see what happens there. We're going to take another quick break, and when we return, we're going to ask the board members about Arlington's priorities in the upcoming General Assembly legislative session. We'll be right back. Welcome back to County Board Wrap-Up. I'm your host, Kara O'Donnell, and our guest today, County Board Chair Katie Crystal and Board Vice Chair Christian Dorsey. Thank you both very much for joining us. Now, each year, the county puts together a legislative package that it tries to get adopted in Richmond during the General Assembly's legislative session, which is rapidly approaching. What are we looking at this year?
It's going to be an interesting one. It's an election year, and it's also the short session, which means, if you can believe it, they are only in session for about a month and a half.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so, possibly this is not the year to advance large, earth-shattering priorities, although we did have that kind of year just in 2018 between Metro funding and Medicaid expansion. So we, as always, prepare a list of priorities, things that are important to Arlington's interests, important to our residents. It's a way of giving guidance to our legislative liaison, who was down in Richmond basically full-time, and a way of reminding ourselves as we all take time in Richmond to lobby and meet with members of the General Assembly about the community priorities we most wish to elevate.
What are those priorities this year?
So a couple of our biggest ones, and this is related to what Christian was just sharing about the budget, really relate to budgetary issues. The General Assembly has taken a lot of actions recently that have big consequences for localities, and most of them are not funded. Or, for example, in the case of Metro funding, the state has tried to solve financial needs by passing the buck onto the localities. So between that and the persistent, what I think would be fair to characterize as a dramatic underfunding of public schools in the Commonwealth, paired with, as Christian was mentioning, some of the unfunded implications of Medicaid expansion, really our top line priority is a reminder to the state, which by the way is experiencing a budget surplus, that this might be a really nice time to revisit some of those many obligations, financial obligations they've passed on to localities, and look for how the state can be taking on a slightly bigger role of its own funding responsibility to those core services.
How optimistic are you that something like that could happen?
Hope springs eternal, Kara.
That's right.
Certainly more optimistic than I would have been 2 years ago.
Okay.
I think there's, fortunately, the issues that we have in our legislative package are not Arlington specific per se. These budget issues are shared by many jurisdictions throughout the state. So it's a matter of equity. It's a matter of fairness. And so when those affect a broad swath of the Commonwealth, I tend to have a higher degree of confidence that we'll see some movement. That doesn't mean I'm confident. It just means it grows from 0 to some.
Okay.
One of the other areas, actually, speaking of statewide coalitions, that I think we're genuinely glad to see in our legislative package this year, and as a result of a lot of advocacy from the League of Women Voters, the Civic Federation, and others, is advocating for Virginia to be the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, which I know a number of people think, wasn't that ratified already, or didn't we fight that fight in the 1970s? The Equal Rights Amendment has never been ratified, and uniquely, Virginia could be in the position to be the final state necessary for its ratification nationally, which we think would be befitting Virginia's history.
That would be exciting.
So we're actually, it's nice to see it in our legislative package reflecting the desires of our citizens, but we would also join a number of localities around the state, including some that you might be surprised by in Southwest Virginia and others, who've all thrown their hats in the ring and said, this is the year to pass the ERA. So we'll be tracking that issue closely.
All right. Well, let's see how that goes, as well as some of the many other issues that the General Assembly will take on. That's going to bring us to the end of County Board Wrap-Up. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Katie and Christian, for offering your insights into the board and its processes. Remember, all of our County Board meetings are open to the public and live streamed and archived on our website. That's arlingtonva.us. Just search County Board. And if you want to tell us what you think about these and other issues, visit our website, topics.arlingtonva.us/engage. I'm Kara O'Donnell, and we'll see you next month right here on County Board Wrap-Up.